Welcome to Winning Paths, the Irish Field Archery monthly podcast, where victory is an adventure mapped with humour, guided by wisdom, and fueled by epic tales. Whether you're here to crush goals, sharpen your mindset, or just enjoy a good laugh, you're in the right place. Subscribe now, and let's tackle life's challenges together, with a wink, a grin, and a strategy that's anything but ordinary. Draw your bow, take aim, and let's hit those targets. Our material is original, born from our intellectual labour and countless hours spent researching, writing, and publishing. Each episode reflects our deep experience as writers and journalists, delivering content that's as insightful as it is engaging. Check for more at tfam.ie. May the wrath of the forgotten echo in the minds of those who dare to doubt the presence of gods, even when the skies themselves are silent. Anhur, the war god, whose name has been eroded by time like the stones of his once great temples, emerges not from the mists of mythology, but from the very marrow of ancient belief, a testament to the fears, hopes, and iron resolve of the people who forged his legend. For Anhur was not simply born of imagination. He was summoned from the crucible of human experience, a divine avatar of the primal forces that shape our world and our souls. In the sweltering heat of ancient Egypt, where the sun beats down with an unforgiving intensity, where the Nile's floodwaters carve life into the desert, and where survival itself is a daily struggle, it is little wonder that the Egyptians turned their gaze to the heavens and saw in their gods not distant, aloof entities, but active participants in the drama of existence. Anhur was their response to the relentless march of war, a figure not just of worship, but of desperate invocation, a force to be reckoned with, to be pleaded with, to be feared and revered in equal measure. With his lion's head and formidable spear, he wasn't merely a construct of the priesthood or a symbol for the military elite. He was a manifestation of the collective psyche, a reflection of the very essence of conflict that had, for millennia, been as much a part of human life as the cycles of the seasons. To the ancient Egyptians, who watched empires rise and fall, who saw the blood of their kin spilled on the sands of battlefields, Anhur wasn't just a war god, he was war itself, distilled into a form they could understand, a form they could perhaps control through prayer and sacrifice. But war, as the Egyptians knew, is never truly controlled, it is unleashed. And so Anhur, for all the rituals and offerings made in his name, remained a capricious god, his favour as unpredictable as the outcome of any battle. The soldiers who marched to war under his banner did so with the knowledge that while Anhur could guide their spears and steady their hands, he could just as easily turn his gaze elsewhere, leaving them to face the horrors of combat alone. This duality, of a god who was both protector and destroyer, both leader and abandoner, mirrored the stark reality of war, where victory and death often walked hand in hand. And yet, despite this, or perhaps because of it, the people believed. They believed in Anhur as surely as they believed in the sunrise, in the inundation of the Nile, in the cycle of life and death that governed their world. For to believe in Anhur was to acknowledge the inescapable truth of existence, that life is a struggle, a conflict, a battle waged not just against enemies, but against the very forces of nature, against fate itself. Anhur, then, was not just a god of war, he was a god of life in all its brutal, uncompromising reality. The myth of Anhur, like all myths, served as a vessel for these truths, carrying them through the generations, shaping the way the Egyptians saw their world and their place in it. His story was not merely told, it was lived. Each time a soldier took up his spear and marched into battle, each time a family prayed for the safe return of their loved ones, each time a victory was won or a city fell, the myth of Anhur was reaffirmed, reenacted, reinforced. The god's presence was felt in the very act of living, in the decisions made on the battlefield, in the whispered prayers of those left behind. Anhur's role as a divine archer is not merely incidental, but rather a fundamental aspect of his identity. Unlike the blunt, sweeping devastation that his spear might suggest, the bow and arrow imply a level of precision, a calculated lethality that requires patience and foresight, traits not often associated with war gods, but vital to the success of any campaign. In ancient times, archery was not just a skill, but a sacred art, and the gods who mastered it, like Anhur, were revered not only for their strength, but for their strategic mind. His association with archery likely stemmed from his role as a protector of the sun god Ra, where his ability to strike down enemies from afar would have been invaluable. In fact, Anhur's mythological narrative bears striking resemblances to other archery-linked deities in later mythologies. For example, one can draw comparisons between Anhur and the Greek god Apollo, who, though primarily associated with the sun and the arts, was also revered as a deadly archer. Both deities occupy a space where their martial prowess is not limited to the battlefield, but extends to the cosmic scale, where their arrows are not just weapons, but instruments of divine will. Similarly, the Norse god Ulla, a less prominent but highly skilled archer, shares Anhur's association with both war and hunting, underscoring a pan-cultural reverence for the bow as a symbol of divine precision and power. But what truly sets Anhur apart in this divine archer narrative is his mythic role as the one who brings back the distant one. This epithet doesn't just reference his rescue of the Eye of Ra, it also evokes the idea of the bow and arrow themselves. One draws back the bowstring to send the arrow out to bring back the kill, much as Anhur ventures into the unknown to retrieve that which has been lost. This metaphorical confluence between the physical act of archery and the mythic journey suggests that Anhur's identity as an archer is more than just an attribute. It is a fundamental aspect of his divine function. Furthermore, the cultural implications of Anhur's connection to archery extend beyond Egypt. During the Ptolemaic period, Anhur was associated with the Greek god Ares, reinforcing his identity as a war god across cultures. The Romans also adopted Anhur, linking him to their martial traditions. Even Emperor Tiberius was depicted in his likeness, demonstrating the god's enduring appeal as a symbol of martial power. The archery motif in Anhur's mythos can also be seen as a precursor to later legends, where the archer is a figure of both skill and destiny. Consider the story of Robin Hood, where the bow becomes not just a weapon, but a symbol of justice and rightful authority. Echoes of Anhur's divine role in restoring balance can be detected here. In each case, the bow and arrow serve as more than mere tools. They are extensions of the wielder's will, carrying with them the power to change the course of history with a single well-placed shot. Yet, despite his martial associations, Anhur was not a god solely of violence. His festivals included playful mock battles, where priests and people would engage in ritualized combat, hinting at the dual nature of war, its capacity to unify as well as destroy. This playful aspect, combined with the precision of his archery, suggests that Anhur's role in Egyptian culture was as much about control and order as it was about chaos and destruction. The people who worshipped Anhur understood this duality. They knew that war was not just a matter of brute force, but of strategy, precision, and sometimes restraint. The bow and arrow in this context became symbols of a deeper understanding of war, a recognition that to strike effectively, one must first be patient, must aim true, and must be prepared to release at the right moment. Anhur, the war god with his bow, embodied this philosophy, offering a model of warfare that was as much about wisdom as it was about strength. And in this way, Anhur was not just a creation of the people, he was a co-creator of their reality. The myths that surrounded him were not static tales, set down once and for all in the annals of history. They were dynamic, evolving, living narratives that changed with the times, that adapted to the needs and fears of the people who told them. Anhur himself may have been depicted in stone and bronze, but the god that the Egyptians worshipped was as fluid as the Nile, as changeable as the winds of the desert. He was a god who could be both distant and near, both merciful and cruel, both a protector and a destroyer. And so, as the centuries passed and the world changed, so too did Anhur. His image, once so fearsome, began to fade as other gods took prominence, as the nature of warfare itself evolved. The once great temples dedicated to him crumbled, and his name was spoken less and less. But even as Anhur receded into the shadows of history, the essence of what he represented remained. The war god might have been forgotten by all but scholars and priests, but the reality of conflict, the brutal truth that Anhur embodied, continued to shape the world. It is this enduring truth that makes the myth of Anhur so compelling, even to us today. For in Anhur we see not just a relic of a bygone age, but a reflection of something universal, something that still resonates in the depths of our collective consciousness. We see in Anhur the embodiment of our own struggles, our own battles, both physical and spiritual. We see in him the acknowledgement that life is, and always has been, a series of conflicts, a succession of challenges that must be faced, even when the odds seem insurmountable. The ancient Egyptians, in their wisdom, understood this. They knew that to face these challenges without the aid of a god like Anhur was to invite defeat, and so they created him, not just as a figure to be worshipped, but as a guide, a protector, and when necessary, a destroyer. In doing so, they kept the spirit of Anhur alive, not just as a god of war, but as a symbol of the eternal struggle that defines the human condition. Anhur, then, was more than just a war god. He was a symbol of the resilience and determination of the human spirit, a reminder that even in the darkest of times there is always a way forward, always a battle to be fought, and, with the right combination of strength, wisdom, and perhaps a little divine intervention, a victory to be won. The people who worshipped Anhur didn't just believe in him, they believed through him. He was the conduit for their hopes, their fears, their very will to survive in a world that was often hostile and unforgiving. And in that belief, they found the strength to carry on, to face the challenges that life threw at them, to fight the battles that needed to be fought, whether on the battlefield or within their own hearts. So, as we consider the myth of Anhur, let us do so not as distant observers, but as participants in the same grand narrative that has been unfolding since the dawn of time. Let us see in Anhur a reflection of ourselves, of our own struggles and triumphs, and let us remember that, like the ancient Egyptians, we too are the creators of our own myths, the shapers of our own destinies. And in doing so, we keep the spirit of Anhur alive, not just as a god of war, but as a symbol of the eternal struggle that defines the human condition. And so, before we step into the familiar drizzly streets of one of the countless Irish towns or villages, it is crucial to consider the deeper currents that ripple beneath the surface of our daily lives, the myths we carry within, the unseen forces that quietly steer our decisions and carve out our fates. Just as the ancient Egyptians looked to Anhur for guidance in a world full of uncertainties, so too do we, often unconsciously, seek the wisdom of our own myths to traverse the unpredictable landscape of life. It is within this intricate dance between the mundane and the divine, between the comfort of routine and the shock of revelation, that our personal narratives truly take shape. Now, in a seemingly peaceful place and time, as ordinary as any other, where life followed its predictable course, a certain man found himself standing on the edge of an abyss, or perhaps it was the abyss that quietly advanced upon him, taking advantage of a rare lapse in his habitual vigilance. This man collided with a force as ancient and powerful as the myths that have been intertwined with the essence of human history since its very beginning. The year was 1885, and in the sleepy, rain-swept village of Cashel, nestled in the shadow of the rock that loomed over the inhabitants like an ancient sentinel, lived the aforementioned hero, Cormac Blakely. Cormac was not a man of notable wealth or exceptional intellect. He was rather average, with a face that could be described as kindly, if one were inclined to generosity, and a disposition that leaned toward melancholy, though not unpleasantly so. He was a man bound to routine, living each day as if it were a carefully measured step in a dance that had long since lost its music. It was on one such day, a day that began like any other, that Cormac found himself trudging through the mud-slicked streets of Cashel, his thoughts occupied with the mundanities of life, whether Mrs. Flaherty had yet mended his trousers, or if the butcher might have any decent cuts of lamb left. Little did he know that his life was about to take a turn so sharp and unexpected. It might have been better for him to have stayed in bed, if only the damp sheets hadn't been so unwelcoming. As Cormac rounded the corner by O'Leary's pub, he nearly collided with a figure so peculiar, so singularly odd, that he stopped dead in his tracks. The man before him was tall, impossibly tall it seemed, though that might have been an illusion brought on by the mists that clung to the air like a wet blanket. He was dressed in a coat of deep green, the kind of green that makes one think of enchanted forests and hidden glades, though it was worn and frayed at the edges, as if it had seen one too many adventures. His hair, which tumbled in unruly curls down to his shoulders, was a vibrant red, the kind of red that might have set a barn on fire if one were to strike a match too close. His eyes, however, were the most unsettling, two piercing orbs of blue that seemed to look straight through Cormac, as if he were little more than a wisp of fog. "Good day to you, Mr. Blakely," the man said in a voice that was both lilting and sharp, like the edge of a well-honed blade. There was a faint smile playing on his lips, though whether it was friendly or mocking, Cormac could not tell. "And a good day to you," Cormac replied, though his voice wavered slightly, for there was something about this stranger that put him ill at ease. "But I don't believe we've had the pleasure of meeting. Might I ask your name?" "Ah, names," the man said with a chuckle, as if the very notion of them were a joke known only to himself. "You may call me Podrick Finlay Flynn, though whether that's my name or merely what I've chosen to be called today, well, that's a matter for the philosophers, wouldn't you agree?" Cormac wasn't quite sure if he agreed or not, but he nodded all the same, feeling that it was the safest course of action. "And what brings you to Cashel, Mr. Flynn?" "Ah, business, Mr. Blakely, business indeed," Flynn said, his grin widening. "I am, you might say, a facilitator of sorts. I make things happen, especially those things that others find difficult to achieve by ordinary means. And it just so happens that I have a proposition for you, one that I believe you will find most intriguing." Cormac's heart sank slightly at the mention of business, for he had little interest in such things and even less money to spend on them. "I'm afraid I'm not in a position to—" "Ah, but you misunderstand me, dear Cormac," Flynn interrupted, raising a hand. His fingers were long and slender, and they moved with a certain grace, as if they belonged to a musician rather than a man of dubious profession. "This is not about money. No, no. What I offer you is something far more valuable, an opportunity, shall we say, to correct a certain imbalance in your life, a chance to change your fortunes, perhaps." The way Flynn's eyes sparkled as he spoke made Cormac uneasy, but there was something compelling in the man's words, something that stirred a flicker of curiosity in his otherwise cautious heart. "And what exactly are you proposing?" "Well, my good man," Flynn said, leaning in slightly as if to impart a great secret, "it has come to my attention that you have recently been, how shall I put it, overlooked by the fairer sex. And this, Mr. Blakely, is a tragedy that I cannot, in good conscience, allow to continue. For you see, I have in my possession a certain elixir, one that is guaranteed to make you irresistible to any woman who might catch your eye." Cormac stared at Flynn in disbelief, certain that the man was either a charlatan or a madman, or perhaps a little of both. But there was a sincerity in Flynn's expression, a gleam of something that Cormac couldn't quite place, a kind of knowingness, as if Flynn were privy to secrets that others could only guess at. "And what's the catch?" Cormac asked, his voice tinged with skepticism. Flynn's grin widened even further, revealing teeth that were just a touch too white, a touch too perfect. "No catch, my dear Cormac, only a small service in return. You see, there's a certain matter that requires a man of your talents, a simple delivery, really, to a certain address. Nothing illegal, of course, just a package that needs to be delivered to the right hands." Cormac hesitated. He wasn't a fool. He knew that nothing in this world came without a price, and that this stranger's offer was too good to be true. But there was something in Flynn's demeanour that was hard to resist, a charm that made Cormac want to believe him, despite his better judgment. "And what's in the package?" Cormac asked, still wary. "Ah, that, my good man, is none of your concern," Flynn said, his tone light but firm. "All you need to do is deliver it, and in return you shall receive the elixir that will change your life. A fair trade, wouldn't you say?" Cormac considered the offer, turning it over in his mind. What harm could there be in delivering a package? And if Flynn's elixir was truly as miraculous as he claimed, then perhaps it was worth the risk. After all, hadn't he spent enough time alone, watching from the sidelines as others lived the lives he longed for? "Very well," Cormac said finally, feeling a strange sense of resolve settle over him. "I'll do it." Flynn clapped him on the shoulder, his grip surprisingly strong. "Excellent. I knew you were a man of sense, Mr. Blakely. Now here's the package." He reached into his coat and produced a small, unremarkable box tied with a length of twine. "Deliver this to the address written on the slip inside, and you shall have your reward." Cormac took the box, feeling its weight in his hands. It was heavier than he expected, though not excessively so. He tucked it under his arm and nodded to Flynn, who gave him a wink and a knowing smile. "Good luck, Mr. Blakely," Flynn said, tipping his hat. "I have a feeling that this will be the start of something truly remarkable for you." And with that, Flynn turned on his heel and disappeared into the fog, leaving Cormac standing alone in the street, clutching the mysterious package and wondering what he had just gotten himself into. The address on the slip of paper inside the box led Cormac to a ramshackle cottage on the outskirts of town, a place that looked as though it hadn't seen a visitor in years. The windows were boarded up, and the roof sagged under the weight of neglect. Cormac hesitated at the gate, his sense of unease growing stronger with each passing moment. But a promise was a promise, and so Cormac steeled himself and approached the door, rapping on it with a trembling hand. The sound echoed through the empty air, and for a long moment there was no response. Just as Cormac was about to turn and leave, the door creaked open, revealing a figure so gaunt and ghostly that Cormac nearly dropped the package in fright. The man, or was it a man, who stood before him was tall and thin, his skin stretched tight over bones that seemed ready to break through at any moment. His eyes were sunken and hollow, and his breath rattled in his chest like dry leaves in the wind. He said nothing, simply extended a bony hand toward Cormac, who reluctantly placed the package into it. The figure nodded once, then closed the door with a finality that left Cormac standing on the doorstep, unsure of what had just transpired. Shaking off the eerie encounter, Cormac made his way back to Cashel, eager to be done with the whole affair and claim his reward. He found Flynn waiting for him at the edge of town, leaning casually against a tree as if he hadn't a care in the world. "Ah, Mr. Blakely, you've returned, and in one piece no less," Flynn said, clapping his hands together. "I knew you were the right man for the job." Cormac handed over the slip of paper as proof of the completed task, feeling a mix of relief and trepidation. "Now, about that elixir," he said, trying to keep the edge of impatience out of his voice. Flynn's grin widened, and from within his coat he produced a small vial filled with a shimmering liquid that seemed to shift colors as it caught the light. "As promised, the elixir of your dreams," Flynn said, holding it out with a flourish. Cormac took the vial, staring at it with a mixture of awe and suspicion. "And this will make you irresistible," Flynn finished for him, his tone dripping with confidence. "But be careful, Mr. Blakely. As with all things of power, there is a price to be paid." "What sort of price?" Cormac asked, suddenly wary. Flynn only smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, nothing too dear, I'm sure. Just don't use it all at once. Moderation in all things, as they say." That night, in the privacy of his small, cluttered room above the cobbler's shop where he worked, Cormac stared at the vial, turning it over and over in his hands. The liquid inside seemed almost alive, swirling with a hypnotic allure. He knew he should be cautious. Flynn's warning echoed in his mind, but the promise of what the elixir could do was too tempting to resist. With a deep breath, Cormac uncorked the vial and took a cautious sip. The liquid was surprisingly sweet, with a warmth that spread through his body like a slow-burning fire. For a moment he felt nothing unusual, and then a rush, a surge of confidence, of vitality, of something else entirely that he couldn't quite name. It was as if the very air around him had shifted, charged with a new energy. The next day, Cormac noticed the change almost immediately. The women of Cashel, who had once barely spared him a glance, now looked at him with newfound interest. Their eyes lingered on him as he walked by, and he found himself engaged in conversations that were suddenly warm and flirtatious, filled with laughter and coy smiles. It was everything Flynn had promised and more. Cormac revelled in his newfound charm, basking in the attention that had so long eluded him. But as the days wore on, something strange began to happen. The more Cormac used the elixir, the more its effects seemed to intensify, and not always in a pleasant way. His interactions with people grew more heated, more charged with an undercurrent of something darker. The laughter that once accompanied his conversations now felt sharp, almost mocking. And it wasn't just the women who noticed him anymore. Men, too, began to eye him with a mix of jealousy and suspicion. One evening, while at O'Leary's pub, Cormac found himself in an altercation with a man he'd never seen before, a hulking brute of a fellow with a temper as fiery as his hair. Words were exchanged, insults thrown, and before Cormac knew it, fists were flying. But what should have been a typical barroom brawl took a turn for the worse when Cormac, in a moment of panic, reached for the vial and took another sip. The change was immediate and terrifying. The world around him seemed to blur, the faces of those in the pub twisting into grotesque masks of fury and fear. His body moved of its own accord, lashing out with a strength that wasn't his own, a force that sent his opponent crashing to the floor, unconscious. The room fell silent, and all eyes were on Cormac, but not with admiration. No, what he saw in their gazes was fear, pure and unadulterated. Stumbling out of the pub, Cormac fled into the night, his mind racing, heart pounding. The elixir, he realized with dawning horror, was not a blessing, but a curse. It had given him what he thought he wanted, at a cost far greater than he could have imagined. As the days passed, Cormac found himself unable to stop using the elixir, even as its effects grew more unpredictable, more dangerous. The once friendly faces of Cashel turned hostile, and whispers of dark magic followed him wherever he went. It wasn't long before the townsfolk began to avoid him altogether, crossing the street when they saw him coming, their eyes filled with a mix of pity and dread. It was in this state of desperation that Cormac sought out Flynn once more, finding him exactly where he had the first time, leaning against the same tree, as if he had never left. "Flynn," Cormac rasped, his voice raw with fear and exhaustion. "You never told me what this would do, what it would really do." Flynn's expression was one of feigned innocence, though there was a glint of something else in his eyes, something dark and knowing. "I told you there would be a price, Mr. Blakely, but you didn't ask what that price was." "I need it to stop," Cormac pleaded. "I need it to end." Flynn tilted his head, considering. "Ah, but once you've started down this path, it's not so easy to turn back. You see, Mr. Blakely, the elixir doesn't just change how others see you, it changes you. And those changes, well, they can't be undone so easily." Panic gripped Cormac as he realized the full extent of what Flynn was saying. "But there must be something, anything, you can do." Flynn sighed, as if this were all a great inconvenience to him. "There is one way, perhaps, but it comes at a price of its own. If you wish to be free of the elixir's influence, you must give up something of equal value." "What do you mean?" Cormac asked, dreading the answer. Flynn's gaze turned cold, his voice low and dangerous. "Your ear, Mr. Blakely, and 2 fingers from your right hand. That is the price." The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Cormac stared at Flynn in disbelief. "My ear? My fingers? A small price to pay, don't you think, for your soul?" Flynn replied with a smile that was anything but kind. Desperation gnawed at Cormac's insides. What choice did he have? To continue using the elixir meant descending further into madness, into darkness, but to lose part of himself, literally, was a fate almost as terrible. Yet with a heavy heart and no other option in sight, Cormac agreed to Flynn's terms. The process was swift, mercifully so, though the pain was unlike anything Cormac had ever experienced. When it was over, he was left with a bandaged stump where his ear had been, and 2 fingers missing from his right hand. Flynn handed him the empty vial, now drained of the elixir that had once promised so much. "You're free now, Mr. Blakely, free to return to your life, such as it is." But Cormac knew better. He knew that he would never be free of what had happened, never be free of the memory of Flynn's eerie smile, the price he had paid for a taste of power. Cashel would never welcome him back, not truly, and the man he had been was gone forever. And so Cormac Blakely became a figure of legend in Cashel, a cautionary tale whispered in the dead of night by those who dared to speak of dark bargains and the price of desire. Padraig Finlay Flynn vanished as mysteriously as he had appeared, leaving behind only questions and the faint scent of brimstone. But those who knew the old stories, the ones from long before Cashel's time, might have recognized something in Flynn's demeanor, in his otherworldly charm and sinister smile. They might have whispered of ancient gods, of deals made with powers far beyond mortal understanding, and in the quiet of the night they might have invoked the name of Anhur, the war god who demanded a price for every victory, and who was never far from the heart of a tale that ended in ruin. As for Cormac, he lived out the rest of his days in solitude, a shadow of the man he had once been. And if, on certain nights, he heard the whisper of a voice on the wind, a voice that sounded suspiciously like Flynn's, he did his best to ignore it, knowing that some bargains, once made, can never truly be undone,